You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender. Today we're discussing the legacy of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, who died last week. He was a controversial figure for many. He was elected president for the first time in 1998 and oversaw an oil boom that enabled him to redistribute wealth, leading to steep falls in the official poverty rate and rises in literacy and school enrolment. He also railed against the US. He once described the then President George W. Bush as the devil during a speech at the United Nations and helped forge an alliance with other Latin American leaders against what they decried as American imperialism. Yet some argue that Chavez did not do as much as he could have done to develop Venezuela, where violent crime has soared and murder rates are higher than in Colombia or Mexico, both of which are racked by drug-related violence. During his lifetime, Chavez had an undeniable impact, but what will his legacy be for Venezuela and Latin America now that he is no longer with us? Joining me in the studio to discuss this are Gianpaolo Rossi-Fedele, a Venezuelan living and working in London, Ian Dunt, editor of politics.co.uk, and Tim Stanley, historian and writer for the Daily Telegraph. Gianpaolo Rossi-Fedele, you're a Venezuelan. How do you think Venezuelans, or what do you personally think Chavez's legacy will be?
I think Chavez is leaving just a double-edged legacy after 14 years governing the country. On one side, you can see the obvious positive legacies of this government. After long social programs which were actually put in place by Chavez, we gave a very successful and positive benchmark to the country. And on the other side, I think the status of the country has been increased much more compared to 14 years ago. I mean, everybody speaks about Venezuela, and that was not the case in 98 before Chavez was elected. There is also negative legacy, obviously related to the situation of the economy, which is quite in a difficult state. In particular, the oil company, the national oil company, which was considered a jewel in the Venezuelan state, is now indebted and has very strong problems in pursuing its production plans. And eventually you have a country which is completely polarized between 51% of the population, which is in a way in favor of Chavez, and the other part which is completely against. So it's very difficult to say positive or negative.
Ian Dunt, what do you believe Chavez's legacy will be?
I hope that the debate isn't going to continue like this, because I think you're about to get a lot of people going, well, on the one hand this and on the other hand this. And it's very hard to appraise him in any other way. To me, the most important is a new sense of pride and healthy nationalist concern about Latin America growing within the continent that was very difficult before. So he's succeeded really in a way by someone like Correa or Evo Morales, other leaders very much in his shadow and in his style, who are starting to show that that Latin America can no longer be considered the United States' backyard. That is a quite terrible phrase that Europe has used for a long time now. It basically justifies imperialism. Chavez came at a time when America's attention was starting to be distracted by the Middle East, and that allowed for this process to take place. Nevertheless, it remains even after he's gone. That's the best thing that he's accomplished. Some of the worst things, unfortunately, will be a slight degrading in civil liberties in the country. Not as severe as his opponents pretend, but nevertheless, it is there.
Tim Stanley, is that Chavez's achievement? He's kind of busted Latin America out of being a kind of sub-region that America can kind of do what it wants in.
There are two ways of doing that. You can build a country which is strong and prosperous and democratic, like Brazil, which is becoming a genuine world leader, or you can build a country which is backwards-looking, which is racked by division, which is nationalistic to the point of nihilistic, like Venezuela, a country that finds itself allied with Iran and with Cuba, with dictatorships. And yes, you'll get some attention on the international stage, but my goodness, that's not the kind of attention I would want if I was Venezuelan. Now, it's undeniable that the quality of life of the very poor in Venezuela has improved. So, for example, the rate of deaths by malnutrition has fallen by half. But the cost of doing that was to follow a pattern of development, which was to take oil monies, to exploit something that had nothing to do with Chavez, which was an increase in oil prices, to exploit that and spend all that money on social services. A very creditable thing to do, don't get me wrong. But to do that while at the same time neglecting building a real free market economy, and to do that in a way that divided people and essentially bought votes so that you create a society which in many ways is actually quite broken. In the first 10 years of Chavez's rule, there were 120,000 murders in Venezuela, of which 90% they never caught who did it. That is a rate of murder 4 times higher than in post-war Iraq. So we are talking about a society that is not confident, that is not finding a new voice on the international stage. We're talking about an increasingly fragmented society represented by a bully and a buffoon.
But sorry, go on.
An extraordinary amount of doublethink going on there. I mean, first of all, you would have to appraise Britain in the same way in terms of our friendships with authoritarian states. For instance, we have very close relations with Saudi Arabia. It's directly comparable to having a close relationship with Iran. Secondly, if you're to look at the way that very free market economies, which most of them are in Latin America, under US influence, influence is a generous word to use, they have very similar rates of crime, of homicide. You look at Guatemala, you take Nicaragua, most of Central America under American influence of insisting on a free market economy has almost identical problems. Most of these problems, I would suggest, come from being from a resource-rich economy, one rich in natural resources. So you're always going to see extraordinary inequality there. His solution to that, of course, was to try and diverge some of those benefits towards the poor. You call that exploiting energy. I would suggest that it's exploitation to not put it towards the poor. So most of the data would suggest that his method would improve things. I accept on the homicide that actually that is not the case. And yet all of these points would be exactly the same for many of the free market economies that neighbour his.
It would only be doublespeak if you presumed that I, for example, supported Britain's association with Saudi Arabia. For me to say that Venezuela allying with Iran is bad, but then for, say, Britain and Saudi Arabia, no, I take the position that we should not be having anything to do with those kind of regimes. But a very big difference between Britain's relationship with authoritarian regimes and Venezuela's is that, for example, Venezuela essentially, under Chavez, gave free passage to FARC, and involving itself in a drug-running war in Colombia, which kills thousands. That, to me, is a very hands-on approach. On the second point about rates of murder, we're talking about developing societies here. There is going to be crime, there's going to be poverty, there's going to be corruption. There's no denying that. The issue is, which path of development do you choose to take? Now, I'm going to say something which is going to sound absolutely horrible, but it has to be said. And that is that in some instances, a developing country following a pattern of socialist development that places an emphasis upon social welfare programs will end up pricing itself out of the global market and will end up creating a system that it simply cannot afford to continue. A comparison would be Robert Mugabe, who in the late 80s and early 90s in Zimbabwe earned top points for education. His people became one of the most literate people in the world. The result? He had incredibly well-read people. But his economy was rubbish, and he had enormous state spending.
Isn't it? Really what you're saying is a howl of despair, because all we'll ever have is a race to the bottom to try and attract investment, which does nothing for the people of developing countries.
But it will work in the long run if that country then develops an economy which it can use and then exploit to build social welfare programs.
Which you would do by training up your population and making them more literate, which all of the information shows Chavez did in Venezuela.
Gianpaolo Rossi-Fedele, let's come to you. I mean, will his kind of form of government or the track that the country is on continue, or is it inevitable that we will have something completely different now because it was so defined by one charismatic individual?
I think to analyze the individual, we need absolutely to look at what was Venezuela before Chavez and the regions of Chavez. Chavez is not coming from endogenous powers setting him in power. He was elected by the people, and he was a sort of reaction by the people of the street against the previous system, which was even more corrupt than this one, even more divisive than this one, and even more polarized than this one. So I don't think a legacy like that can be cancelled over time in 1 week or in 1 year. And my forecast is that for the next elections in April, 14th of April, there will be a landslide victory for Nicolás Maduro. One, because we had an election 6 months ago where, against all odds, Chavez won with a very strong margin. And we have also the sympathy effect, which will help a lot Nicolas Maduro in getting a quite strong result in April.
What kind of a guy is Maduro? Is he going to follow the Chavez line on everything, or does he have his own ideas, or what do you think?
It's difficult to say, but apparently from what we have seen so far, it looks like this is more Chavez without Chavez. It's like the most hardliner, and that's the reason why Chavez has elected him as a successor for the regime.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're discussing the legacy of the Venezuelan president Hugo Chavez, who died last week. Joining me are Gianpaolo Rossi-Fedele, a Venezuelan working and living in London, Ian Dunt, editor of politics.co.uk, and Tim Stanley, historian and writer for the Daily Telegraph. Ian Dunt, where do you see Chavismo going now that the man himself is no longer here?
Well, it's not entirely a bad thing that he's no longer here, and I say this advisedly. I don't like to speak ill of the dead or anything. I think that there were signs of mania. Some of the Allo Presidente programs that we saw, some of the ways, he was speaking against judges and eventually having them imprisoned. He was ordering military preparations on there. It looked like the beginning of a Mugabe-style government. So I think as a person, it's better that he's out of power. I'd rather it didn't involve him dying. And hopefully we can see a continuation of many of the social policies and the continuation of the genuine democracy that exists in Venezuela, despite what its protractors say.
Tim Stanley, I want to ask you, do you agree, firstly, with the premise that Chavez did help build a sense of pride for much of Latin America, or do you think that this would have happened anyway with the emergence of Brazil?
I don't disagree that there is a growing sense of pride. My issue is what is that pride rooted in and whether or not it is a healthy thing for the continent and whether or not everybody shares that sense of pride. There is also a Latin American tradition of liberal bourgeois democratic government, which was very strong until the 60s and 70s, until you start to get populist leaders like Chavez turning up on the scene. To segue that into the issue of legacy, one person who he seems very similar to me is Juan Perón, who creates this model of an incredibly charismatic leader who has an ideology which steals from left and right and who becomes identified with the nation. And that's all very well and good while he's alive. But after he dies, you then, rather than moving into multi-party democracy, as it should do, you get that one movement retaining its political power and then people within it competing over what it means and what its future will be. And you can chart the demise of Argentina's economy and society from the legacy of Perón and from the legacy of Perón dying and people competing to fill that vacuum. And my fear for Venezuela is when you basically give up on liberal bourgeois democracy and hand things over to a democratically elected tyrant, a tyrant but democratically elected. When you do that, you then create a new system based not upon the legitimacy of power, but upon the legitimacy of personality. And when that personality goes, well, I think when
on the basis of what evidence?
When you shut down radio stations, when you shut down newspapers, when you bully judges.
These radio stations are coordinated coups against his palace. These are privately owned radio stations that helped coordinate a coup against him. If they did anything like that in Britain, we would not tolerate that radio station continuing.
Chavez himself, one might argue that we do.
No, of course we do not.
Chavez himself, his first attempt at national politics was a coup.
That's true, isn't it?
Well, of course it is. It is. He failed coup, and then he went on to be elected. I mean, that does not somehow legitimize any regime that would allow coups to be freely organised in the country. It's completely absurd. It's not unreasonable for him to have shut down some stations. It remained until the day he died. The overwhelming majority of commercial radio stations and commercial TV broadcasters were all against Chavez. I mean, this is hardly the behaviour of a tyrant. He had won many more elections than Gordon Brown, our last Prime Minister, had won.
It's absurd. You can still elections and govern in an authoritarian manner.
So he has a free press. He's won several elections. So precisely what is it that makes him a tyrant?
Well, because first of all, you take money, you give it to people to buy their votes. Secondly, you intimidate the opposition. Thirdly, you close down newspapers and radio stations. This does not sound to me like a healthy model of democracy. This is someone with, at the very least, a tyrannical streak, shall we say.
Gianpaolo Rossi-Fedele, how do you feel about what you're hearing here, people say about Chavez?
My feeling is that technically it's not true that you take the money and you buy the votes of the people. The people are voting because they believe Chavez is the best option, and the people vote against Chavez because you can vote also against Chavez because you think it's the worst option. I think in our country there is just a lack of real civil society since all the economy is controlled by the state, and not because the state has been nationalized, but because only the only activity which is actually producing dollars is the petroleum industry, which has been always into the hands of the state. Without an oil industry, which is actually providing for cash to all the economy, there is no way for any civil society to be created, because there is no any private enterprise which can work freely without the money from the state. So you are not only buying the people, you are buying all the country in a single or a sort of a pact where all the petrodollars have to be shared between the people, and eventually everybody agrees, even the people who eventually are against Chavez.
Yes, and it seems to me that when you create a system whereby the state has that kind of monopoly over the economy, over civil society, over political debate, and I do believe attempted to have one over the media, when you do that, well, that seems to me like the road to tyranny.
I think it's a very strange idea that because you nationalise certain industries that you lose civil society. In actual fact, you see a complete breakdown of civil society. Let's take, for instance, Chile under Pinochet. We had the overthrow, American-backed overthrow of Salvador Allende, a very, very principled social democrat, not a socialist. And then we saw Pinochet come in, who implemented a great free market.
Allende was
absolutely,
a Marxist.
in fact, absolutely not. And if you look at the moderate policies that were followed by the Allende government, you would see that that is a completely inaccurate way to describe it. Nevertheless,
It's how he described
when Pinochet
himself.
comes in,
It's how he described himself.
when Pinochet comes in, it's a free market experiment, the likes of which the world had very rarely seen before. What kind of civil society did Chile have under Pinochet, if the standard of a civil society is that you've privatized your sectors, all your energy sectors, etc.?
None, because he was a butcher. He was a military dictator. So that's got nothing to do with the economic policies. That's to do with the fact that he was a dictator, replacing, by the way, a Marxist.
Gianpaolo Rossi-Fedele, you want to come in here?
I would like just to give you a small example, very symbolic, about how to control the civil society. To print papers, newspapers, you need paper. Venezuela doesn't produce pulp paper, so you need to buy it. Normally they buy it from Canada. To buy it, you need American dollars. If you are not following some rules within the state, you don't get the permission to obtain the dollars, to buy the pulp for the paper, to make paper for the newspapers. And this is all related to the fact that the financial flows are controlled by the state, and no private or individual organization can handle a real opposition without money.
Is there a desire on the part of people who would like to develop a civil society in Venezuela to change all this?
It would be very difficult at the time being. I think this is going to stay as it is during the present oil prices. If we will see prices over $100, as we see now, I think the state will be able to control all the revenues and to keep the people in favor and the people against under control. I think the only possibility of a change will be a sharp reduction in oil prices, where the national company will not be able to afford all the programs, social and non-social, and there will be some question issued, not only amongst the opposition, but also amongst the people supporting Chavez and Maduro.
And why don't we ask ourselves, why does it continue to be such a popular regime? It's not really 51%. It's actually, as you alluded to in the last election, a much more substantial level of support in Venezuela. Why might that be? Because actually we're showing that you can drag people out of extreme poverty. That went from, I think it's 26% to 8% according to World Bank figures in Venezuela under the.
But surely this is the easy gain. Surely this is the easy gain. You redistribute some of the wealth, you knock out some of the worst poverty. But surely the hard stuff is what Gianpaolo has been talking about there, is going to the next level, developing a thriving, entrepreneurial civil society.
That's part of it. Absolutely, that's difficult.
And has Chavez managed to do that? The suggestion seems to be that he hasn't.
And certainly we're not going to start talking about him as the most perfect leader or the angelic image that perhaps some of his followers would like us to talk about him in those terms. What we can do is say that compared to other countries in Latin America, where we have seen a much more free market attitude, where we have seen them basically do exactly what Washington has demanded, we've actually seen more improvement in reducing poverty and increasing literacy and improving the loss of the poor. And that does give you some explanation for why they keep on voting him back in.
But is the story here, Tim Stanley, one more of oil than of Chavez, even though he's an extremely colourful character? Oil goes up above $100 and there's a lot more money to dish out. So what?
To be fair, when you have that kind of economy based on resources, it can go either way. You can have societies that have that enormous benefit and it doesn't work for them. Angola would be an example of that. It has to be managed. And I'm not denying that he has used that money to improve the lot of his people. But my goodness, it's not It's not as difficult to win elections and to lower poverty when you're sitting on a massive amount of oil than it would be if you weren't sitting on a massive amount of oil. And Gianpaolo made a very important point, which is what will happen when oil prices drop considerably. One of the things that undid Peronism in Argentina was the international collapse in beef prices. And that made it impossible to finance his social revolution. And if that happens in Venezuela, well, then you not only have a crisis for the Chavez movement, but you have a crisis for Venezuelans too, because they'll find themselves in an economy which is top-heavy when it comes to social spending and which does not have a healthy civil society or free market to fall back on.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and today we're discussing the legacy of the Venezuelan president Hugo Chavez, who died last week. Tim Stanley, do you think that there will be a legacy of Chavez, let's say, for the wider world, and indeed for us in the West? You know, do you think that his public defiance of America has in some way impacted our own view of, given us a broader view of parts of the world that we haven't necessarily thought of about so much before?
I think absolutely. Ian made a very good point earlier about how the Middle East distracted us from what was going on in Latin America. Well, I think one group that were aware of that were the European left. And I think for the left, he has emerged as a more legitimate icon than Cuba's Castro is, because Castro really is just a dictator. Whereas Chavez, here is populism, here is social egalitarianism, here is someone who stood up against the USA. I personally feel all of that was nihilistic and negative and not good for the people of Venezuela. But I think for the world, he has given, he has been a figure of a hope and an alternative model of development. And for that reason, I suppose that he is, at least for our political discourse, quite healthy. But it's much nicer to sit in London and admire Chavez from afar than it is to actually live in Venezuela and have to live with those high rates of crime, corruption, inflation running at 30%, and stubborn unemployment.
Quite right. And it is also much easier to say similar things about all the other economies in Latin America where that is the case. And you could go down the list of almost any of them. I mean, you know, start at Mexico and then go work your way down Guatemala, Honduras. You will always see this, and most of the time it comes from Washington's influence. And this is it. When we try to say, let's fall back on a free market, that they need that for their civil society. Now, I'm not a communist myself. I believe in mixed economies. However, when they followed the free market model instigated by Washington, often at the end of a gun, we saw what happened, which is corruption, poverty, militarism, and in Guatemala, for instance, the orchestrated rape of the indigenous population by people who are armed by the US. So this idea of all this sweetness and light in the free market and all this tyranny and darkness whenever one tries to nationalize anything doesn't really stand up to any kind of scrutiny.
Gianpaolo Rossi-Fedele, I want to ask, Chavez is obviously a sort of towering figure in Latin America, presumably particularly among Spanish-speaking countries. We've heard that some people say that Brazil presents a more positive image, but they speak Portuguese. How significant is this language barrier, or is there a sort of sense that among Venezuelans that they would like their country to resemble Brazil more?
Probably amongst middle class and upper class Venezuelan, they would like to resemble more to the United States, not to Brazil. Unfortunately, and one of the mistakes of the past is that Venezuela has been always looking up north in order to find an identification of who we are and where are we going. Some people in Caracas or in Maracaibo, they think they are more or less close to Miami. And people don't look south to the rest of the continent. So one of the legacies probably of Chavez was to show people that the country is in South America and not next to Miami.
What do you make of the plan to embalm Chavez, to have his body permanently on display for all eternity? How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't feel very well about that. It follows a long, a very long tradition coming from the Soviet Union and has been followed also in North Korea and I think also in China when Mao died.
And Vietnam. But there are a surprising number of other leaders when you look into it who have been embalmed. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I did look at a list and there were some surprises there.
I think it's derived from
on the left. Mao, Lenin, something about those social democrats in inverted commas, because they don't believe in heaven, they have to go on living in this world. And, this is actually a very serious point. You can usually tell a tyrant or a potential tyrant by looking at him. Al Murray, the British comedian, made a very good joke on Twitter. He said, whenever a man wears a beret when he doesn't have to, he's usually a wrong 'un. And it's quite true of Chavez as well. When you prance around in uniforms like that, strutting across the world stage, behaving in that manner, and then when there's a discussion of having you embalmed after death, it's usually a good sign that you weren't very healthy for your country.
Most of the people that have been embalmed typically demanded that it didn't take place. I don't know what Chavez said, but, take someone like Ho Chi Minh or Lenin, for instance, these guys really didn't want it. And I don't blame them, because I've seen embalmed bodies before, and it's quite freakish, frankly. I didn't really enjoy any part of it. It's like some kind of political Madame Tussauds.
Do you think it will happen, the embalming?
I think it will happen because it was a decision by Maduro. I don't think that Chavez requested that.
In fact, do you think it's important for the continuation of Chavismo that the body remains highly visible?
It shouldn't be important that a body stays there forever to continue the legacy of Chavism. So I would have preferred this not happening in Caracas. Probably they will need to show people that Chavez is still there, and that the people who represent Chavez are actually the real Chavistas by having this body displayed somewhere in Caracas.
Ian Dunt, who is the next Chavez then in Latin America? Is there a new figure coming up who will sort of take on this mantle as a sort of figurehead for a newly confident continent?
Not that I'm aware of. I do think that we should spend some more time looking at what Evo Morales is doing in Bolivia. I think it's some quite extraordinary achievements, and he could turn into a man of great stature as well. Not least of all because he is indigenous, and it is extremely pleasing to see someone from a culture that has been so terribly sort of violated in the past historically actually starting to lead a country. But beyond that, I'm afraid I have no special information to offer.
Tim Stanley, the post-Chavez direction for Latin America.
I have no idea, although, of course, Christine Kirchner is doing something similar rhetorically in Argentina by trying to prop up her failing regime by threatening the Falklands. What I would say is this, from a philosophical point of view: the best kind of head of state or politician is someone whose name you can't quite remember. Power should be held very lightly, used very lightly, and it's a sign of a healthy civil society if who's in power doesn't really matter or impact upon you. So I think the fact that someone is well known on the international stage, whether they be from the right or left, is usually actually a bad sign.
Well, we've run out of time. I'd just like to wrap up by going around the table. We've covered this to some extent already, but I just want to ask, in a sentence, if you can sum up the legacy on a national, international, or whatever kind of scale you want. Just sum up what Chavez has for a legacy, Ian Dunt.
The return of pride and some semblance of social justice to Latin America, albeit wrapped in some quite problematic attitudes towards political power and civil liberties.
Tim Stanley.
An eccentric bully who distracted both his country and the world for a very long time. The show was a lot of fun.
And Gianpaolo Rossi-Fedele.
Don't forget that there have been many countries we have been benefiting from the Chavez regime in the last 14 years. Not only Cuba, but the rest of Latin America have been getting a lot of subsidies. So we will see what is going to be the biggest element between the positive and the negative legacy.
I'd like to thank my guests, Gianpaolo Rossi-Fedele, a Venezuelan working and living in London, Ian Dunt, editor of politics.co.uk, and Tim Stanley, a historian and writer for the Daily Telegraph. Thank you all very much.